When Napoleon commanded his first battle at Toulon, all his drummers were killed. Hail came to the rescue and turned the tide of battle for the French. Abel Gance's film was one of the peaks in a decade of dazzling achievement by France. But Gance had known war at first hand. He knew that every victory is paid for at great cost. For the French, the cost of victory in 1918 was a shattered economy, and for its film industry, which had once led the world, the loss of its markets to America. But this had been the war to end war. Film people came back from the armed forces with a sense of exhilaration. They didn't care that studios were antiquated and badly equipped. They took their cameras into the streets, as with this film improvised with the children of Montmartre. From the days of Lumière, the French had managed to capture spontaneity and atmosphere using natural locations. Rural France had always attracted filmmakers, never more so than now. Members of a new movement regarded themselves as animated impressionists. They were led by theatre director André Antoine. Well over 60, he lamented that he wasn't a younger man. He felt cinema should now be a liberating force, freeing artists from the constrictions of theatre and studio, and bringing audiences the look and feel of real life. He called his approach cinéma libre, free cinema. La Terre, from the Zola novel, was shot on a farm near Chartres. Buteau is married to Françoise's sister, but he thinks that gives him access to Françoise herself. Françoise is played by Germaine Roue.
Il me grondait parfois, mais très gentiment, parce que comme j'avais jamais rien fait, était très maladroite, alors il me disait, mais il a des mains de paysanne. Je lui disais, je ne peux pas avoir des mains de paysanne, mais essayez d'avoir des mains de paysanne. Voilà ce qu'il me disait. À ce moment-là, je me mettais par terre, puis je grattais la terre. Alors je faisais rire tout le monde.
Antoine's films had a remarkable documentary quality, but they were not popular. His last film about barge life was never released. Such films needed a touch of romance to draw the crowds. Jean Epstein made such a film featuring Blanche Montel.
Ça s'appelait La Belle Nivernaise, et quand on m'avait engagé, naïvement, j'avais peut-être cru que c'était moi la Belle Nivernaise. Pas du tout, c'était le bateau. Bien vieux.
Shot on the Seine between Paris and Rouen, La Belle Nivernaise was an inspiration for Jean Vigo's famous La Talente, made 10 years later. Henri Pouctal went to the steel mills of Le Creusot as the background for his massive 8-hour adaptation of Zola's novel. A worker who has devoted his whole life to the factory is made redundant. He is too old. He cannot face life. Roue was made on an even more heroic scale. Director Abel Gance chose to shoot the film almost entirely on location. Yet it was notable for the kind of fluid camera work that could usually only be achieved in a studio. Gance built his sets among the marshalling yards of the Gare Saint-Roch near Nice. Gance was a cinematic poet. To him, the cinema was both art and religion. With his chief cameraman, Léonce-Henri Burel, he felt no challenge should be beyond him, and surmounted them using simple, though potentially dangerous, means. Gance revealed all kinds of surprises. Offered the cream of French acting talent, he chose his leading lady from the English cinema. Ivy Close was a celebrated beauty, the wife of a famous photographer and the mother of future director Ronald Neame. She played Norma, a girl orphaned in a crash who is brought up thinking Ellie is her brother. But she falls in love with him, while Sisyphe, her stepfather, is obsessed with her. When Norma goes away to marry a virtual stranger, Sisyphe becomes suicidal and murderous. He decides to crash his engine, to kill both the things he loves. Roue was among the most remarkable films in the entire history of the cinema, for it introduced rapid cutting, a style historians have always attributed to later films from Soviet Russia. Here, Gance does it for the first time. It was inspired, he said, by music. The cinema to him was the music of light. Gance quoted Victor Hugo, "Creation is a great wheel which does not move without crushing someone." Which is how financier Charles Pathé must have felt as the film went far over budget, and he argued and pleaded with Gance, but he realized that Gance was in trouble. His beloved fiancée, Ida Danis, had fallen ill with tuberculosis, often incurable in those days.
Qui font que la Roue a obéi à sa maladie et que, parti en somme de Paris, j'ai dû aller à Chamonix, j'ai dû aller ensuite dans les Landes, j'ai dû ensuite revenir à nouveau à Saint-Gervais, j'ai dû à nouveau repartir pour Paris. Enfin, je me suis déplacé autant que son état a nécessité. Ce n'était pas la Roue qui m'obligeait à le faire, c'était son état.
In the story, Sisyphe's eyesight is damaged and he is reduced to driving a funicular railway at Mont Blanc. The actor playing Sisyphe, Séverin Mas, was also incurably ill. The experience was traumatic for Gance as his lover's life ebbed away.
Elle a commencé à être malade le jour où j'ai commencé l'écriture, et elle est morte le jour où j'ai terminé.
Gance was too grief-stricken to complete the film, so he seized the chance of a trip to New York to get away from himself, as he put it. He attended a gala showing of his pacifist epic J'accuse. The film might never have been shown in America, but he met D.W. Griffith, who ensured distribution through United Artists. Gance returned to France, bursting with ideas, and transformed the film, which he planned to show in episodes. La Roue, 3 years in the making and 3 times longer than planned, opened at the Gaumont Palace in December 1922. Public attendance was beyond Gance's wildest dreams. There had never been a screening like it in Europe.
Les gens s'impatientaient, les taxis, les voitures klaxonnaient, c'était vraiment noir de monde. Et comme les portes ne s'ouvraient pas, la foule a poussé les portes. Avec le final du film, il y a eu un tel enthousiasme dans la salle, et Gance est arrivé au milieu de la piste. Il a passé le mégaphone à un régisseur qui a dit « Monsieur Gance est très ému, ne peut pas vous parler. Il propose qu'on bisse la dernière bobine. » Ça a été vraiment un très très grand moment du cinéma.
Now completely blind, Sisyphe awaits death in his lonely cabin. There is cinema before and after La Roue, said Jean Cocteau, as there is painting before and after Picasso. The French had a tradition of films shown over several weeks. The backers of Les Miserables, however, wanted the story reduced to a single film, but the director held out for a version of several episodes. Using locations, Henri Fescourt was able to set the story in the places indicated by Victor Hugo. Montreuil-sur-Mer looked exactly as it had when Hugo visited the town in 1837. Fescourt subordinated everything to the story, but 4 months into production, the death of the German backer forced him to leave the convents and gardens of old France and staged the rest as best he could. While the sewers of Paris looked alarmingly authentic, the scenes of the Paris insurrection staged in the studio seemed artificial by comparison. But the film was so popular that it was even accorded a showing in America, cut from 32 reels to 8. Serials were the most popular films made in France. They acted as a bulwark against the onrush of American films by giving exhibitors a guaranteed audience for 8 to 12 weeks at a time. This one was so phenomenally successful it led to a sequel, to a flood of costume dramas. It was even used to block the Hollywood version made by the great Douglas Fairbanks. His Three Musketeers was kept from the screens of France and much of the rest of Europe for nearly a decade. Otherwise, since the war, the Americans had had everything their own way. Jackie Coogan brought the crowds in 1922 with a personal appearance in Paris with his parents. Coogan was famous for his performance with Chaplin in The Kid. Jacques Feder depicted a similar relationship in his version of Anatole France's story with the great stage actor Maurice de Feraudy and the young Jean Forest. In this case, the boy has saved the old man from suicide and gives him a new reason for living. The old man is a vegetable seller in Paris, and it was these scenes, shot at Les Halles, which particularly captivated the Americans. D.W. Griffith declared, "I have seen a film which for me precisely symbolizes Paris." Feder directed another film with Jean Forest, this time in Switzerland, Burel's camera work putting the magnificent scenery to dramatic use. Feder revealed himself as one of the finest directors in Europe. In this story, which he wrote himself, he takes us into the world of a child. A boy's mother has died. Unable to accept her death, the boy pretends his mother is still with him. His father eventually remarries, and the boy has not only a stepmother, but a stepsister to contend with. The boy and his younger sister regard the newcomer with hostility. One evening, Jean notices that his new stepmother is wearing a brooch that originally belonged to his mother. Overcome by guilt, having put the life of his stepsister at risk, Jean feels life is not worth living. The climactic rescue, so reminiscent of a Griffith film, brings the boy close at last to his stepmother. The French industry did not depend on stars in the American sense. The nearest equivalent was the Spanish actress Raquel Meyer. She already had a huge following as a singer. La Violetera, her most famous song, led to her being cast as a flower seller who steals from a lady later to become the Empress of France. Entirely shot on location, this chase was photographed in Seville by Jules Crugier. The film was directed by Henri Roussel. It was a story of urban terrorism. Violetta's brother is an anarchist intent on blowing up the Empress's carriage. Violetta, who has become a close friend of the Empress, discovers the plan and decides to sacrifice herself, disguised as the Empress. Violetta survives because the carriage has been packed with the Empress' favorite flowers, imperial violets. Now that the French film industry had recovered from the war, it was competing with Germany as the leader of Europe. The number of French films was rising every year. Through co-productions with other European countries, it was hoped to challenge the dominance of America. Enthusiasm had been there from the beginning, but now the French studios worked to such a high standard that filmmakers flocked to them from all over Europe. The importance of the industry was officially recognized when a film was presented at the Paris Opera, the most prestigious theatre in France, in the presence of the Prime Minister, Monsieur Dumergue. The film was the epic Miracle of the Wolves, set in the France of the 15th century. Reflecting this new esteem, a company was formed specially to produce great historical films. The Miracle of the Wolves was staged at Carcassonne, a restored medieval fortified town in the south of France. Owing much to Griffith's intolerance, it outstripped most other epics for sheer scale and daring. Director Raymond Bernard pioneered the use of handheld cameras. It was the most expensive historical film ever staged in France, but when it reached America, it was dismissed. Said Photoplay magazine, more than half this picture should have been cut out. Among the cast was Marie Glory, then known as Arlette Génie.
Et ça faisait pas Hollywood. Il n'y avait pas tant d'argent, mais il y avait peut-être plus d'élan, moins de technique et peut-être plus de beauté naturelle.
Pierre Blanchard played a Polish patriot in the company's second great epic about the Polish rebellion against the Russians in 1776. Sophie Varoska, Edith Jeanne, hears the noise of battle and realizes her compatriots are being defeated. In an astonishing sequence, she overcomes her despair by imagining the Polish rebels winning a brilliant victory. The close collaboration of composer Henri Rabaud and director Raymond Bernard was a major part of the film's success. Another Russian invasion was welcomed by the French. Culturally, there had long been an affinity between the two countries. A film unit on a Paris rooftop consists of white Russian émigrés. Directors like Alexander Volkov and Vyacheslav Turyansky, producers like Alexander Kamenka, and actors like Ivan Muzhukin had been driven out of Russia by the Civil War, and most of them settled in Paris. This scene from Volkov's film about the wild life of the 18th century English actor Edmund Kean was set in a London tavern. Ivan Muzhukin plays Kean. The White Russians adopted Gance's rapid cutting with the enthusiasm that would soon be shown by the Red Russians. The Russians who worked on Kean celebrated the Russian Christmas at Billancourt Studios. They had all been hired to work on a new film about Napoleon. Volkov agreed to become an assistant to the director, Abel Gance, and he helped create the kaleidoscopic snowball fight led by the young Napoleon at his cadet school. Challenged by Kean, Gance determined to take the idea of rapid cutting to its limits. The snowball fight was shot by Jules Crougier, equipped with debris camera mounted on his chest. Gance wanted the audience to participate in the action, to feel itself punched on the nose. Gance and Volkov had cameras fitted to every conceivable device. This was a sort of sledge-mounted guillotine, enabling the camera to swoop and dive. Long before camera motors became standard, they had a camera which could pan automatically through 360 degrees. All this had to be designed and constructed by engineer Simon Feldman, another Russian émigré. Taking his company to Corsica, Gance wanted an epic chase which would outclass any Western, to carry the spectator into the pursuit. He and Volkov decided to put the camera on a horse, and turned to Simon Feldman. Feldman was the unsung hero of Napoleon. Once more he had to put into action Gance's wild dreams. Feldman was 103 when this interview was filmed.
On se prépare de cavalerie en marche.
Neither clockwork nor electric motors were practical. He had to build an apparatus using a steam engine modified to work with compressed air.
Air comprimé qui fait tourner la caméra. Voilà. Le petit appareil moteur qui fait tourner la caméra.
perhaps the greatest challenge was to find an actor with charisma enough to play Napoleon. Gance tested scores of people, including Ivan Mojoukin, René Fauchois, and Harry Cremer. An old friend was Albert Dieudonné, but Gance thought he was too old. One night, Dieudonné put on uniform and went to Fontainebleau, where Gance was staying. He got the part at once. Fontainebleau had been Napoleon's palace. Dieudonné also visited a night watchman who claimed to see the emperor regularly.
Alors je suis arrivé, j'ai ouvert la porte brusquement, j'étais naturellement en uniforme, et je lui ai dit, eh bien Matard, alors, on dort quand on est de garde? Alors ce malheureux s'est réveillé, il était ahuri, il s'est frotté les yeux, il me regardait, n'est-ce pas, et puis je suis parti. Et le lendemain, il a dit à Desparbès, eh bien vous savez, monsieur le conservateur, je ne vous mens pas. Hier, je l'ai vraiment vu, Napoléon. Avant, je plaisantais un petit peu. Je vous disais ça pour vous faire rire, mais cette fois-ci, je l'ai vu. Malheureusement, ce pauvre homme est mort 8 jours après. Est-ce moi qui suis une des causes de... Mais enfin, en tout cas, il est mort en ayant vu Napoléon. Il avait réalisé le rêve de sa vie, comme moi, j'ai réalisé le mien en interprétant le film d'Abel Gance.
The studios at Billancourt, built on the profits of the Three Musketeers, had come on the market. Gance bought them, and in order to stage one of the most spectacular sequences ever shot in a studio, he had them specially equipped. The Battle of Toulon had taken place in a torrential rainstorm at night, and Gance had decided the only way to do it was to shoot in controlled conditions with rain provided by the local fire brigade. But when an accidental explosion occurred, Gance took the full blast. By the time he had recovered enough to resume shooting, his left hand was still bandaged.
Et il avait les mains bandées, il se servait d'un porte-voix pour donner ses indications, et c'est comme ça qu'il arrivait à galvaniser les acteurs et créer cette atmosphère d'électricité qui régnait sur le plateau.
Harry Cremer played Roger de Lille, composer of the Marseillaise.
Pour Dieudonné, ça devait aussi l'aider magnifiquement. Quant à moi, c'est ça qui m'avait donné cette profonde concentration dans mon regard.
The part of Danton was played by the Russian singer Alexandre Kubitsky.
Pour les acteurs, c'était extraordinaire parce qu'ils avaient un support qui régnait sur le plateau. C'était plus des figurants, ils participaient, ils vivaient la situation, et cette magnifique envolée de la Marseillaise.
The storm was almost literally staged in a teacup. This tiny tank took the full force of thousands of gallons of water discharged from huge barrels. Gance had used more techniques in this film than anyone had used in any other. Now he wanted to visualize Victor Hugo's phrase, "To be a member of the convention was to be a wave on the ocean." Once again, he turned to Simone Feldman, who devised a pendulum to give the camera the movement of a wave. But even this was not enough for Gance.
Je sentais dans certaines scènes que je manquais d'espace et que je n'avais pas, que l'image était trop petite pour moi. Même une grande image était trop petite. Et c'est un jour que j'écrivais dans le Midi des scènes de la Convention qu'il m'est venu l'idée d'étendre l'écran. Et comme je ne savais pas comment l'étendre, je me suis dit, mais si je mets un appareil qui prend ce champ-là, un appareil qui prend ce champ devant moi, et un troisième qui prend ce champ-là, j'aurai un énorme panorama. Il est évident qu'à partir du moment où j'ai senti cette possibilité, je me suis dit qu'il y avait là un nouvel alphabet pour le cinéma.
Gance's system of 3 cameras mounted on top of each other was too cumbersome. The answer would be a method of producing widescreen effects with a single lens. Henri Chrétien was inspired to develop such a lens after seeing Napoleon. He patented the process as hypergonère, and the first film to use it was To Build a Fire, adapted from Jack London. Only these frames survive. The film was directed by Claude Autant-Lara,
qui a été interdit. Les exploitants français ont reçu l'ordre d'interdire dans la salle le procédé nouveau de l'hypergonère du professeur Chrétien. Donc vous voyez, ça venait de très loin. On a menacé même l'exploitant qui était là de lui retirer sa licence, la possibilité d'appartenir au syndicat des exploitants s'il ne retirait pas immédiatement le film.
The industry wasn't ready for the new process. The Chrétien lens lay in limbo until 1953, when the Americans rediscovered it as CinemaScope. The normal screen seemed full enough of spectacular images in the 1920s. Pathé color was now at its peak. This was a device by which color was added to the black and white image. A stencil was cut a frame at a time using a pantograph, often with astonishing results. Casanova, a collaboration with the German company UFA, starred Ivan Muzhukin. Jean Renoir's adaptation of Zola was partly made in Berlin. By the mid-1920s, French and German co-productions were becoming more and more frequent. Jean Renoir was the son of the great painter Auguste. His father's last model, Catherine Essling, became Jean's wife in 1920, and she starred in all his early films. Like Renoir, René Clair was one of the new young filmmakers. His film gently and affectionately mocks the bourgeois Parisians of the turn of the century. The film revolves around a hat. Its owners have threatened to destroy the bridegroom's apartment if it's not replaced. He fears the worst. René Clair had come to filmmaking through the avant-garde. In the heady atmosphere of Paris in the 1920s, young artists were excited by surrealism and the opportunities offered by film. The Seashell and the Clergyman was made by one of France's few women directors, Germaine Dulac, and it caused a sensation when it was first shown. But only one art cinema served as an outlet for films like this by Man Ray. Whereas Marcel L'Herbier brought the avant-garde to the regular cinema-going public. Marcel L'Herbier was the aristocrat of the avant-garde. He was concerned with design and employed artists like Fernand Léger, Cavalcanti, Autant Lara, and the architect Mallet Stevens. As a director, he was thought to be coldly intellectual, but his experiments were influential, even if audiences often disliked them.
Il avait l'œil, il réglait beaucoup ses lumières lui-même. Oui, je crois vraiment que c'était, avant tout, avant de faire jouer ses acteurs, je crois que c'était un merveilleux photographe. Merveilleux.
Le cas L'Herbier sur un plateau, c'était très curieux, parce que c'était le gentleman tiré à 4 épingles, traversant les plâtras sans avoir la moindre chose sur lui. On ne comprenait pas pourquoi.
As early as 1920, he was experimenting with lighting, lenses, and editing. Not all his experiments were appreciated. Playing a role in this scene is L'Herbier's designer, Claude Autant Lara.
Le film étant terminé, On a projeté le film en séance dans une petite salle de projection, rue de la Villette, à M. Léon Gaumont. Moi j'étais dans le coin comme ça. Et puis alors, M. Marcel Herbier était avec M. Léon Gaumont, madame et toute la famille et tout ça. Et puis alors les images sont arrivées. À un moment, les images sont arrivées avec les déformations qu'avait imaginé Marcel Herbier. On a entendu la voix de M. Gaumont qui disait « Le point !» Il y a eu un silence respectueux, personne n'osait rien dire. Puis comme ça continuait, qu'il y en avait d'autres images qui étaient aussi comme ça, le point opérateur. On a arrêté la projection, M. Gaumont s'est levé en disant qu'est-ce qu'il y a qui ne va pas, et alors l'herbier était obligé de s'approcher de M. Gaumont, lui dire écoutez, vous savez, c'est une vision personnelle, M. Gaumont.
A personal vision of devastating power was made at Biencourt Studios by the Danish Carl Dreyer. In this torture sequence there is no violence. Everything works by suggestion to compel Joan to submit. Joan was played by René Falconetti. Dreyer was given a free hand to make a great film to match the same company as Napoleon. German art director Hermann Warm built him a massive set, but Dreyer refused to show it. He concentrated on the human face and the emotions it could arouse. Nobody had ever done anything like it before. This was a purely experimental film made at huge cost. Audiences of the time disliked it, and it was a commercial failure. Yet it survives as one of the classics of the silent era.
Le producteur, effrayé par le premier montage de ce film, on ne voyait que des gros plans, alors que des plans d'ensemble existaient, à l'insu de Dreyer, a fait monter une version avec plans d'ensemble, plans moyens, gros plans, etc. Quand Dreyer a appris ça, il est entré dans une colère noire, et en définitive, cette version du producteur n'est jamais sortie, heureusement d'ailleurs.
Another Joan of Arc was made at almost the same time by Marco de Gastine with Simone Genevois. This had the epic scale Dreyer's producers had hoped for. It took 2 years to make. Despite its superb reconstruction, the film has been eclipsed by the Dreyer version. The excitement caused by the first solo flight across the Atlantic by the American pilot Charles Lindbergh was reflected in films like L'Argent, even though it was adapted from the 19th century Zola novel. Marie Glory played the lead.
Et le scénario s'était inspiré de l'exploit de Lindbergh, qui venait de passer l'Atlantique. Alors, comme on ne parlait que de cet exploit-là, L'Argent, qui est de Zola, a été accommodé à la sauce Lindbergh.
Marcel L'Herbier took the techniques of Napoleon and adapted them to a modern story set in the French Stock Exchange. One young film enthusiast wanted to make a record.
Et moi, avec le culot de mes 20 ans, je dis à L'Herbier, et pourquoi je ne ferais pas un film sur votre film? Et il dit, ça veut dire quoi? Je dis, ça veut dire que vous me donnez une caméra, et cette caméra va vous regarder travailler, et comme ça, on verra comment se fait un film. C'était la toute première fois qu'on faisait ça. L'Herbier, qui était très avide de publicité, il faut pas se le dissimuler, L'Herbier me dit, d'accord.
A Franco-German co-production, the film had a budget of nearly 5 million francs. Jules Crugier had more sophisticated equipment, and many felt the technique of film could be taken no further. Artistically, France and Germany, moving closer and closer together, were even sharing their most famous stars, Brigitte Helm with Pierre Alcover. The German actress Dieter Parlow plays a French girl arriving in Paris for the first time. Au Bonheur des Dames was another film which updated Zola and was equally inventive in cinematic terms, but it was overshadowed by the arrival of sound. The style of director Julien Duvivier combined American confidence with German studio methods and French élan. Despite the depression and the arrival of talkies across the Atlantic, the French film industry was buoyant. Its future seemed limitless.